We're now joined from Budapest by Zoltán Kovács. He's the spokesman for the Hungarian government. Good to have you on the program again, sir. With this new law, why is Hungary punishing people for showing compassion to migrants?
Well, that's not at all the aim or goal of the new package we have accepted. For the past 3 years, we've been very consistent in closing the legal loopholes that exist by now in the Hungarian and the international law, and that is organizations, so-called NGOs, camouflaging themselves as humanitarian, philanthropic organizations, are basically actively helping and inciting illegal migration. The goal is to cut and close all the loopholes that are there, and nobody has anything to fear if they follow the law.
Okay, well, I want to ask you about what the UN Human Rights Chief Zeid Ra'ad Al Hussein had to say. He said the constant stoking of hatred by the current government for political gain has led to this latest shameful development, which is blatantly xenophobic and runs counter to European and international human rights standards and values. And he's right, isn't he? Because EU law guarantees that people have the right to asylum, something you're taking away from them. How do you feel about that?
Well, first of all, I'm afraid he is no authority to give us any advice, especially lesson, if it's about the will of the Hungarian people and how we formulate it into our legal system. And second, we've seen that political bias and political attacks coming from people who are devoted to migration and who are basically pro-migration in their career and in their offices, which they were not entitled and not intended to do so. So what we see at the borders of the European Union, at the borders of the European continent, we all know is not a refugee crisis, it's a migration crisis. Less than 10% of those who are arriving recently are eligible for any kind of legal status. Therefore, we need to readjust our measures to stop what is happening at the borders of Europe. Hungary has been very explicit and consistent on that for the past 3 years, and this is the mandate with which our Prime Minister is going to participate at the European Council meeting today. Stop migration at the borders, defend the borders accordingly, and return everybody who is not eligible to stay in Europe.
You mentioned what you called so-called NGOs. And you said, you know, there's something else masquerading as NGOs. What's your problem with George Soros? Tell me what's your problem with him?
Well, we face here an international speculant who's earning lots of money, and that money is being spent around the globe for obvious purposes. Most of these purposes are being interpreted and, again, camouflaged as philanthropic goals and aims. But we all know that money always talks. He's got a vision about the working of the world, open society, and other philosophical concepts. And very definitely, he's got a plan. He's got a vision about the future of Europe if it's about migration. And we fully disagree. And not only Hungary, but the Visegrad Four and more European countries have recognized that the activity of the Soros-founded and organized organization in Europe, around the globe, are going against democratically elected European governments, the will of the European people. Mr. Soros has no democratic mandate to represent and go for political decisions he was going for the past couple of years.
But do you really believe all of that, that this old rich Jew wants to flood your country with mainly Muslim migrants and somehow transform your society? It's very much a conspiracy theory, isn't it?
No, it is not, and it has nothing to do with religion. I would like to refute what you suggest here.
Although religion is central to a lot of the criticism of Soros, if you see it from among nationalists within the country, you'd accept that.
Well, I mean, you have to be very careful about formulating charges like that, because that does not suit a television station.
The government sets the tone. The government definitely sets the tone.
We have always maintained. We have nothing to do with Mr. Soros's dissent. We have nothing to do with Mr. Soros's religion, neither with the religion of migrants who are coming to the European Union. Keep in mind that Hungary has registered over 100 countries or nationalities trying to reach the European Union. So what we face and see here is a global phenomenon which should be addressed accordingly, and that is defending the European borders, reinstating the rule of law. And if someone and his organizations are going against the rule of law and reinstating legality at the borders of the European Union, we are going to name it. That's what we've been doing for the past 3 years.
Looking at the numbers, there's about 3,500 refugees in the country. And in the first quarter of 2018, according to the best available information that I have, which comes from the government, there were only 325 applications filed for asylum. So immigration is down in your country. Aren't you guys making a big deal of a non-issue here when it comes to your country specifically?
Yeah, but you have to stop here for a second. There's an obvious reason there are no more illegal migrants in the country, and that is we have built a fence. We have introduced 2 other measure systems, and that is we have adjusted our legal system, as we have mentioned earlier, and also we have deployed personnel on the ground. So we have a 3-fold defensive system at the borders of Hungary, therefore at the borders of the European Union. No wonder that we were able to reduce the number of illegal migrants to almost 0 for the past couple of months or years. And that's the example we believe Europe should be following. There's no other way to address the consequences of illegal migration until you address the very problem itself, and that is everybody is coming to the European Union illegally across the borders of the European Union. The borders should be defended. Illegal migration should be stopped.
Tell me about the constitutional amendment which says that an alien population should not settle in Hungary. Help me understand, what does that mean? What is an alien population?
As all countries around the globe and all cultures around the globe, every country and culture has its own characteristics. And we just simply refuse and refute any attempt on behalf of any bureaucracy or body that would like to change that. And that is to decide instead of us, I mean the Hungarians, the Hungarian parliament, who shall live with us in or within the boundaries of the country. This is all about, I believe the constitutional amendment gives all the means at the hands of the Hungarian government as well as the Hungarian people to defend their sovereignty and again to go against any kind of decision on behalf, say, the Brussels bureaucracy or any international body that would try to suggest that mingling, importing or transferring larger number of people from different cultural backgrounds to given countries is going to do anything good. What we see around the globe, it is not working. The melting pot theory, integration is simply not working.
Certainly. Can you give me an example of a culture that doesn't fit into Hungary and Hungarian culture?
We see increasingly for the past couple of years or rather decades by now in Western Europe that parallel societies are developing. Islamic culture is a different culture from the Christian foundations we have in Europe. It's no superior, no inferior. It's simply different. It's following its own rules. Accordingly, it's not going to melt into what the Western European politicians believe should be some kind of non-religion or non-cultural specific culture. We don't believe in that idea, especially in face of the lessons and consequences we see in Western Europe.
Can somebody be Muslim and Hungarian at the same time?
Sure, it is possible, but there is always, again, as I suggested, there's always a major characteristic of a society. We have around, to the best of my knowledge, around 10,000 Muslims living in Hungary, Hungarian Muslims. They very much integrated into Hungarian society. But of course, numbers and ratio do matter. And this is what we would like to avoid. We see bad lessons and bad example coming from Western Europe.
Zoltán Kovács, it's been great getting some insight into the mindset of the Hungarian government. I thank you once again for joining us here on the Newsmakers. Let's broaden out this discussion now. Joining me now from Brussels is Catherine Woollard. She's the Secretary General of the European Council for Refugees and Exiles. Also in Brussels is Philippe Dam. He's the Advocacy Director for Europe and Central Asia at Human Rights Watch. I thank you both for joining us. Catherine, let me begin with you. You heard my interview with Zoltán Kovács. What did you think? What does that tell you about not only what Hungary thinks, but what a growing trend of countries and administrations in Europe tend to think about refugees and migrants?
I think we see Hungary as an outlier here, and I think the interview we just heard confirms that one of the real crises in Europe is not the migration crisis, it's the crisis of rule of law and the attack on the rule of law. We're expecting by the end of this year that our members and our partners in Hungary will be in prison. And so this is a situation where we call on the EU and on other member states to take action against Hungary. Enough is enough. And the offences that are now that may be punished by imprisonment include things such as giving out leaflets, giving legal advice to refugees, which are quite standard civil society activities. But any kind of opposition is frowned upon.
Right. Philippe, given that everybody's getting together and talking migration, even though Catherine might say Hungary is an outlier here, we have the Austrians and the Italians maybe closer to the Hungarians than to some of the other European countries. With that in mind, can anything positive come out of this migration summit, or are we going to see two very polarized camps locking horns?
Yes, what we are seeing is, the number of arrivals, irregular arrivals through the Mediterranean Sea has largely decreased in Europe. And despite this, it's shocking to see that a number of EU politicians, including in Hungary, continue to engineer panic on migrations and in fact fuel hatred at home and create a distorted debate on migration in Europe. What we need to say today is it's not a crisis for Europe anymore, but what it is that it's a crisis for first countries of arrival, Italy, Greece, and Spain, and it's still a crisis for the asylum seekers and migrants who remain stranded in those situations. And I hope that EU Council summit this week will lead to a real reflection about how to fix the flaws of the Dublin system, provide more solidarity, and help the countries of arrival to deal with the continued number of arrival on the ocean. That means more solidarity. That doesn't mean fueling hatred.
Catherine Woollard, one of the answers proposed is offshore processing or disembarkation centers in North Africa. Is that a reasonable solution?
It's not a feasible solution at the moment. It's legally problematic because it's not clear how people will access basic legal rights, such as the right to legal advice, the right to an appeals process from such centres. But it's also politically problematic because why should these countries host centres for Europe? 90% of the world's refugees are outside Europe, so the idea of outsourcing responsibility to other regions is not well received. And we don't see any countries willing to host such centres. So legally and politically, in terms of security, there may also be risks because such centres could become magnets for smugglers and traffickers.
Philippe Dam, we heard from Angela
the
Merkel.
The solution as we would see it.
Certainly. Catherine, let's go to Philippe for a second. We heard from Angela Merkel that the migration challenge is make or break for the EU ahead of the summit. Is she right?
Well, for sure, this is a summit which is going to change the way in which the EU is going to look at migration. The propositions to externalize processing of asylum seekers would really put the EU in very dangerous waters. The examples of such policy that we've been seeing, in particular in Australia, has led to massive abuses, massive suffering, and this is not what we want to see reproduced by the EU. So it's really important for the EU to say no to such models of outsourcing of asylum processing, and it's important for the EU at this moment to find solution to the uncertainty that it put itself by letting boats of rescued migrants drift on the ocean. We need more certainty. Probably the proposition to set up regional disembarkation centers can work if it's prioritizing disembarkation within the EU, and if it's saying no to situations outside of the EU where basic standards would not be met, where there would not be any independent verification of the situation, and where detention would be the norm. It's important for the EU to stand to these principles which have shaped asylum, and it's important for this summit to stand up to those principles. The response is not by outsourcing responsibilities and misery, it's by developing more solidarity among EU member states.
Catherine, in the build-up to the summit, we saw extraordinary drama and chaos with the rescue boat Aquarius, countries not wanting to take those migrants, eventually Spain stepping up. That entire saga, what did that tell you about where we are right now in 2018 with migration?
Clearly we see it remains an extremely tense issue. First of all, we'd say it's not the moment for macho posturing or political games when boatloads of rescued people are in the middle of the sea. I hope we're moving now to a more reasonable solution, and one of those solutions could be regional coordination mechanism within Europe with a division of responsibility for disembarkation and other member states stepping in to offer relocation when a boat of rescued people has docked. So we're seeing solutions starting to emerge. It becomes clear that it may not be possible to get solutions that all 28 member states buy into. So the coalition of the willing, setting up solidarity among smaller groups, as it started to come out of the mini-summit at the weekend, may well be the way forward. It's essential that Europe remains a place that offers protection to refugees, and that includes allowing rescue ships to dock.
Okay, let's bring in from Krakow, Dominik Tarczynski now. He's a member of the Polish Parliament for the ruling Law and Justice Party. Dominik, good to inject you into this conversation. Dominik, your party and your government not big fans of immigration into Poland at this moment in time. That summit's happening. It's discussing migration. What do you want to come out of it?
Well, it's not. Well, first of all, we would like to be listened. These new solutions, new summits will not help. We've been saying that hotspots, bringing people to Europe, will not solve the problem. We have to help them where they are, where the real problem is, in Syria, in Iraq. You know, even now when we are having people from Africa, Africa is over 1 billion people. How many can we receive? 100 million, 200 million, 500 millions? So that's the question to Angela Merkel, who started this madness. We have to call things as they are. This is madness. So she has to listen. She has to have a dialogue. She has to have the attitude which is ready to cooperate. At the moment, they are having another summits, another meetings, another talks, and nothing coming out of it. So listen to Poland, listen to Hungary, listen to Italy. It's not about only a Visegrad group. Listen to Chancellor of Austria and others. There is so many countries who are against it, right, because it's dangerous. It's dangerous for Europe, not only financially, but also it's about our identity.
Okay. Oh, interesting. You say it's about your identity. Catherine Woollard. So again, I almost circle back to the beginning. I ask you, what does this tell you when so many countries in Europe reflect this attitude? In many ways, it's populist. Yes, it's nationalist. But of course, it's also democratic. This is what the people want. Whether you believe they're given good messages or not, this is what the people who voted in the ruling party in Poland want. How do we solve that riddle, Catherine?
Well, let's be clear, there's a lot of myths about what the people want. In the majority of European countries, the public strongly supports offering protection to refugees, and a majority also supports immigration. We have a number of countries where we see extremists in the government, and unsurprisingly, when extremists are part of the government and controlling institutions, public opinion starts to change. In a country like Hungary, after years of propaganda on this issue, it's unfortunate but not surprising that the public starts to believe some of this. We're trying to take the debate back to reason and rationality. If we're talking about migration more widely, one of the other crises that Europe faces is the demographic crisis. It would actually be in Europe's interest to start absorbing new populations, and there are going to be severe economic problems if that doesn't happen. Instead, we see a disproportionate focus on the discourse, the myths, and the propaganda of the extremists, who in a small number of countries are part of the government. It's not a majority.
Okay.
In fact, we see in most European countries the voting share of these parties is either stable or declining.
Right. Let me get a response from Dominik. So Dominik, you're pushing myths and propaganda. If you absorbed migrants, it would be good for your economy, is one of the arguments. What's your response?
Well, first of all, I'm not nationalist. I'm not a populist. I'm not a fascist. I was called many names. I'm a proud European and proud Polish citizen. We are modern, we are open, and we don't want to have our families to be killed. The numbers are not lying. Many of the terrorist attacks were committed by refugees, not illegal immigrants, but refugees. It's just a fact, as it was in Paris. 3 out of 5 suicide bombers were refugees. So we are open to help, but for those who are going through the legal path, who are applying for asylum, not coming with the boats with the hundreds of thousands, if you would try to cross the border in Turkey, in Great Britain, whatever, you would be killed. Just because there are 100 or 200 or 300 of them, they are not allowed to cross the border. They are allowed to apply for the asylum, and we have a legal path to do so. We are helping. We are spending a lot of money. And, you know, I went to Lebanon 4 times. I spoke to these people. They don't want to come. Those who are coming, paying the smugglers to come to Germany. I met the foreign minister of Romania. I spoke to him. And he says, you know what happened when I went to the hotspot to receive a first 100? They ran away when they found out that they are not going to Germany. So Germany was looking for cheap labor, and they found some of illegal immigrants being terrorists. It's just a fact, but it's not about terrorism itself. As I mentioned, it's about our identity.
So let me go to Philippe. Philippe, is there anything that Dominik said there that you have sympathy for?
Well, I think, circling back to what I said to start with, what we are hearing here is really engineering panic around migration issues, and encompassing, comparing, asking for refugee and running away from war, such as many, who had to come 2 years ago did, with equating that with terrorism is really not the right answer to appease the debate and ensure that we can speak about migration and asylum in an appeased way. And this is what we have to do today. There are still a number of people who arrive to Europe by sea. They have the right to apply for asylum. EU member states have the right to accept or refuse this right to asylum, but it's not by insulting people fleeing war and conflict that we are going to have a good discussion about the matter.
Okay, looking forward to seeing and hearing what comes out of the summit. Unfortunately, I've got to move on.
I did not insult anyone, if I may.
Okay, Dominik says he did not insult anybody. I don't feel he directly did.
I did not insult
everybody
anyone.
Had their say.
I'm just talking about facts.
Okay, fair enough, Dominik. Philippe, Dominik and Catherine, I thank you all for joining us here on The Newsmakers.